So, the psychology of people who feel out of place, almost everywhere. There's something profoundly unsettling about walking into a room full of people and feeling like you're speaking a different language, even when everyone's using the same words. It's not social anxiety, though people love to call it that. It's not shyness, and it's definitely not about lacking confidence. It's something else entirely, something most people never have to think about because they've never experienced it. It's the persistent, quiet sensation that you exist slightly outside the frame of normal human interaction, like you're watching a movie everyone else is starring in. If you've felt this most of your life, across different jobs, different friend groups, different cities, different relationships, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And here's the thing nobody talks about. This feeling doesn't come from nowhere. It's not a character flaw. It's not proof that something's broken inside you. What you're experiencing is actually a specific psychological phenomenon that reveals something fascinating about how your mind processes social reality compared to most other people. And what you're going to understand today changes completely the form how you see your entire social existence. Let's start by destroying the most common misconception. When you tell people you often feel out of place, they immediately assume one of three things. You're socially awkward, you're judging everyone around you, or you haven't found your people yet. All three of these are usually wrong. The research on social belonging shows something counterintuitive. People who chronically feel out of place often have perfectly functional social skills. They can navigate conversations, read social cues, even charm people when necessary. Many are described by others as likable, interesting, easy to talk to. But here's where it gets interesting. Feeling socially competent and feeling socially connected are processed in completely different regions of the brain. You can be good at the mechanics of social interaction, while simultaneously experiencing what psychologists call subjective social isolation, a persistent internal sense of disconnection that exists regardless of how many people are around you or how well the interaction is going on the surface. This isn't about skill. It's about resonance. This sounds contradictory, but neuroscience explains why. The brain's social processing network, particularly the temporoparietal junction and the medial prefrontal cortex, doesn't just track what people are saying and doing. It's constantly running predictive models about shared understanding, about whether the people around you are operating from the same fundamental framework of meaning that you are. When there's alignment, you feel that sense of social flow, that effortless quality to interaction. When there's misalignment, even subtle misalignment, your brain registers it. Not as danger exactly, but as difference, as distance. What this means is you're not imagining it. When you feel out of place, your brain has detected an actual pattern mismatch between your internal processing and the group's collective processing. You're not broken. You're calibrated differently. And this calibration, this specific way your mind engages with social reality, it has profound implications that extend far beyond just feeling weird at parties. Now, before we go deeper, I want to say something directly. This is not a diagnosis. This is not pathology. If you're someone who resonates with this, you've probably spent years wondering if something's wrong with you, if you're too sensitive, too analytical, too detached, too something. The answer is no. What you have is a particular cognitive and emotional architecture that processes human experience through a different filter than the majority. And neuroscience, psychology, and even anthropological research on human diversity suggests that this isn't a bug, it's a variant. A legitimate, functional variant that's been part of human populations across cultures and throughout history. The people who watch this channel who find their way to content like this, they tend to share something specific. They think differently. Not better, not worse, just differently. They notice patterns others don't. They question assumptions others accept. They feel depth where others feel simplicity. And if that's you, if you're someone who's been searching for frameworks that actually explain your internal experience instead of just dismissing it or trying to fix it, then you're in the right place. Because everything we explore here is built for people who've spent their entire lives translating themselves into a language that never quite fit. Let's talk about the first major concept that explains this experience: cognitive empathy versus affective empathy, and more specifically, the difference between simulation-based social processing and observation-based social processing. Most people operate primarily through simulation. When they're in a social situation, their brain automatically mirrors the emotional states of people around them. They feel what others feel, almost like emotional contagion. This creates an immediate, intuitive sense of connection. It's fast, it's automatic, and it makes social belonging feel natural because the internal experience is synchronized with the group's emotional rhythm. But there's another mode of social processing, one that's less common but equally valid. It's observation-based. Instead of automatically simulating the emotions of others, your brain steps back and analyzes. You watch, you interpret, you understand cognitively what people are feeling and why they're feeling it, sometimes with incredible accuracy, but you don't feel it with them in the same visceral way. You're running a different algorithm. Where most people experience social situations as immersion, you experience them as translation. Research in social neuroscience has identified these as distinct processing styles, and here's what's crucial: neither is superior. Simulation gives you immediate emotional resonance, but can make you vulnerable to groupthink and emotional overwhelm. Observation gives you clarity and psychological distance, but can make you feel like you're on the outside of human connection, even when you're physically in the middle of it. And if you're wired more toward observation, which many people who feel chronically out of place are, then you've spent your whole life in rooms full of people who are dancing to music you can hear but not feel. A study published in Neuropsychological Research examined individuals with high cognitive empathy but lower affective empathy, meaning people who understand emotions brilliantly but don't catch them like a cold the way most people do. What they found was fascinating. These individuals reported significantly higher levels of subjective loneliness, not because they lacked social connection, but because the quality of that connection felt fundamentally different. They could connect intellectually, but the emotional synchronization that most people use as the foundation of closeness was simply absent or muted. They were surrounded by people, engaged in relationships, but internally experienced a kind of pervasive solitude. Does that sound familiar? Because this is the heart of feeling out of place. It's not about being alone. It's about being surrounded by a kind of connection that your brain doesn't process as connection. It's like everyone's listening to the same song and swaying together, and you can see the beauty of it. You can analyze the rhythm. You can even move in time with it, but you're not hearing the melody the same way. You're there, but you're not there. Now, here's where it gets deeper. Your brain isn't just processing social information differently in the moment. It's also building a completely different model of what social connection is supposed to feel like. And this is where dopamine comes in. Dopamine, as most people know by now, is heavily involved in reward, motivation, and reinforcement. But what's less discussed is how dopamine shapes your expectations of social reward. For most people, social interaction itself is inherently rewarding. The brain releases dopamine in response to laughter, to shared experiences, to being part of a group. This creates a feedback loop. Social engagement feels good, so you seek more of it, which makes you better at it, which makes it feel even better. It's a self-reinforcing system. But if your brain's reward system is calibrated differently, if the dopamine response to generic social interaction is muted or inconsistent, then the entire feedback loop changes. What happens instead is your brain starts seeking reward in other places. Depth over breadth. Meaning over belonging. Intellectual resonance over emotional synchronization. You might get a dopamine hit from a conversation that explores a complex idea, from a moment of genuine vulnerability, from someone really understanding something you said. But small talk, surface-level friendships, group dynamics built on shared activity rather than shared meaning, those don't register the same way. Your brain has literally learned to find reward in different social currencies. This isn't about being snobby or elitist, it's about neurological reinforcement. If your brain doesn't release the same reward chemicals for the same social stimuli that most people respond to, you're going to naturally drift toward different types of interaction. And when the majority of social environments are built around those common reward triggers, laughter, shared activities, group cohesion, you're going to feel out of place, not because you're doing anything wrong, but because your reward system is playing a different game. Research on individual differences in social reward processing has shown that people vary wildly in what their brains find socially rewarding. Some people get massive dopamine responses from being in large groups. Others get almost nothing from that but get significant reward from one-on-one depth. Some people find validation rewarding, others find autonomy rewarding. And critically, these differences are relatively stable across the lifespan. They're not something you can just rewire through exposure or willpower. They're part of your neurological architecture. So when you walk into a party and feel that familiar sense of disconnection, when you're in a meeting and everyone's laughing at something that doesn't strike you as funny, when you're in a relationship and your partner accuses you of being distant even though you feel like you're trying, what's happening is a fundamental mismatch between your brain's reward circuitry and the social reward structures that surround you. You're not failing at being social. You're succeeding at being yourself in a context that wasn't designed for your neurology. Let's talk about two different psychological profiles, two different ways of existing in social reality. I'm going to call them participators and observers, but understand these aren't rigid categories. They're spectrums, and most people fall somewhere along them. But the extremes are useful for understanding the contrast. Participators experience social reality as something they're inside of. When they're in a group, they feel absorbed into the group's emotional field. Their sense of self becomes somewhat fluid, blending with the collective energy. They laugh when the group laughs. They feel excited when the group is excited. Their identity is, in many ways, relational. It's defined by their role in the social ecosystem around them. They're the friend, the colleague, the teammate. And this isn't superficial. It's how they experience meaning. Connection, for them, is immersion. Observers, on the other hand, experience social reality as something they're adjacent to. Even when they're physically present, even when they're actively participating, there's a part of their mind that remains separate, watching, analyzing, maintaining a degree of psychological distance. Their sense of self is more fixed, more internalized. It doesn't shift based on the group. They can engage, they can contribute, but they never fully dissolve into the collective emotional experience. Connection, for them, is understanding, not immersion. Here's the critical part. Both of these are completely valid ways of being human. Participators aren't shallow. Observers aren't cold. These are different cognitive strategies for navigating the social world, and both have strengths and costs. Participators get the benefit of easy belonging, but they're more vulnerable to losing themselves in group dynamics, to adopting beliefs and behaviors that aren't truly theirs just to maintain harmony. Observers get the benefit of clarity and independence, but they pay the price of chronic low-level loneliness, of never quite feeling like they're in the same world as everyone else. If you're reading this and you've always felt out of place, you're almost certainly more observer than participator. And what's important to understand is that this isn't something you chose. It's not a defense mechanism you developed because you were hurt, though painful experiences can reinforce it. It's more fundamental than that. It's how your mind is structured. Some brains are built to merge, others are built to witness. And the world, because it's designed by and for the majority, is overwhelmingly built for merging. Think about every social expectation you've ever encountered. Be a team player. Go with the flow. Don't overthink it. Just have fun. All of these are instructions for participators. They make perfect sense if your brain naturally does those things. But if you're an observer, if your brain doesn't just go with the flow, because it's constantly monitoring, analyzing, maintaining that observational distance, then those instructions feel impossible. Not because you're failing, but because they're asking you to operate against your fundamental wiring. And this is where the feeling of being out of place comes from. You're not out of place in reality. You're out of place in a social paradigm that assumes everyone processes connection the same way. You're the observer in a participator world, and the tragedy is that you've probably spent your whole life thinking the problem is you, when actually the problem is the assumption that there's only one valid way to be socially human. Let's go deeper into something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough: empathy allocation, identity, and the self-esteem economy. Most people think empathy is a universal good, something you either have or you don't. But empathy is actually a resource, and like any resource, people allocate it strategically, often without conscious awareness. The question isn't whether you have empathy, it's where you direct it and why. For most people, empathy flows most easily toward people they identify with, their tribe, their group, their in-group. This is basic evolutionary psychology. Your brain is wired to care more about people who are similar to you because, historically, those were the people whose survival was tied to your survival. So when you're in a group of people who share your background, your values, your sense of humor, your brain relaxes. It allocates empathy freely. You feel warmth, connection, belonging. This is what social ease feels like neurologically. It's your brain recognizing similarity and releasing the neurochemicals that make bonding feel good. But what happens when you don't have a clear in-group? What happens when you've never quite felt like you fit into any tribe? This is where people who feel chronically out of place diverge from the norm. Because if you don't have a strong group identity, if you've always existed on the periphery of multiple groups without fully belonging to any, your brain doesn't have a default target for empathy. Instead, it either distributes empathy more universally, which can feel exhausting, or it becomes more selective, reserving empathy for individuals rather than groups, for people who demonstrate depth rather than people who simply share surface-level traits. Research on social identity theory shows that people derive significant self-esteem from group membership. When you're part of a group, especially a group you value, your brain treats the group's successes as your successes. You feel pride when your team wins, validation when your community is recognized. This is called reflected glory, and it's a major source of self-worth for most people. But if you've never had that strong group attachment, if you've always felt like an outsider, you don't get to draw from that well. Your self-esteem has to come from somewhere else. For many observers, self-esteem becomes internalized. Instead of deriving worth from belonging to something larger, you derive it from individual competence, from understanding, from integrity, from being true to your internal standards. This sounds noble, and in some ways it is, but it's also isolating. Because while participators get constant microdoses of validation from their groups, you're operating on a much leaner validation economy. You have to generate your own sense of worth, and that's exhausting. It's also why criticism, even mild criticism, can hit observers so hard. You don't have a group buffering you. You don't have a tribe to fall back on. It's just you and your internal sense of self, and when that gets challenged, it feels destabilizing in a way that people with strong group identities rarely experience. Here's the paradox. Observers often have more stable identities than participators, because your sense of self isn't defined by your relationships or your group memberships. It doesn't shift as much. You know who you are independent of context. But that stability comes at the cost of connection. You're solid, but you're alone in your solidity. Participators are more fluid, more adaptive, but they're also more connected because their fluidity allows them to blend with others. And this is why feeling out of place is so tied to identity. It's not just that you don't feel like you belong. It's that your entire psychological architecture is built around not needing to belong in the way most people need to belong. You've learned to stand alone because you had to. And now, even when you want connection, even when you're actively trying to feel part of something, your brain doesn't process belonging the same way. The circuitry is different. The reward is different. The entire game is different. Now we need to talk about origins, not because your past defines you, but because understanding where this pattern comes from can help you stop blaming yourself for it. The feeling of being out of place doesn't usually start in adulthood. It starts early, often in childhood, and it starts with a very specific type of experience. The repeated realization that you process reality differently than the people around you. Maybe you were the kid who asked too many questions. Maybe you were the one who didn't find the same things fun that everyone else found fun. Maybe you were more sensitive to noise, to chaos, to emotional intensity. Maybe you just thought differently, processed differently, and no matter how hard you tried to fit in, there was always this gap between you and everyone else. And here's what happens neurologically when that's your experience. Your brain learns that safety and authenticity are in conflict. Most kids learn that being themselves leads to acceptance. They express their natural personality, and the group embraces them, or at least doesn't reject them. This creates a feedback loop, where authenticity feels safe. But if you were a kid whose natural self didn't quite align with group norms, you learned the opposite. You learned that being fully yourself leads to confusion, to exclusion, to being misunderstood. So your brain developed a strategy. Observation instead of participation. You learned to watch, to analyze, to translate yourself into a version that was more palatable, while keeping your real self private. This isn't trauma in the clinical sense, though for some people it overlaps with trauma. It's more like a developmental adaptation. Your brain, recognizing that full immersion in social dynamics led to friction, developed a new mode, engaged detachment. You could be present without being vulnerable. You could participate without fully investing. And over time, this became your default. It became so automatic that you probably don't even realize you're doing it. You just know that you always feel a little bit outside, a little bit separate, even in moments that are supposed to be connecting. Psychologists call this hyper-awareness or self-consciousness, but those terms make it sound like a disorder. It's not. It's a survival strategy, and it's incredibly effective at protecting you from the pain of not fitting in. The cost, of course, is that you also protect yourself from the full experience of connection, even when connection is available. Your brain, having learned early that groups are unpredictable, maintains a defensive distance, not because you want to, but because it's what kept you safe when you were younger. There's also a specific psychological phenomenon called rejection sensitivity, which is common in people who've experienced repeated social exclusion or misunderstanding. Your brain becomes hypervigilant to signs of rejection, interpreting ambiguous social cues as negative, anticipating disconnection before it happens. And here's the cruel irony: this sensitivity, which developed to protect you, actually makes feeling out of place worse. Because even when people are accepting you, even when the interaction is going well, your brain is scanning for the inevitable moment when they realize you're different and pull away. You're living in a constant state of waiting for the other shoe to drop. But this sounds contradictory, but all of this is actually a sign of deep intelligence. Your brain correctly identified a pattern. You are different. And instead of denying that difference or trying to erase it, your brain found a way to navigate the world while preserving your authenticity. You didn't become someone else. You didn't force yourself to fit a mold that would have destroyed you. You stayed yourself, and you developed the psychological tools to survive as yourself in a world that wasn't quite built for you. That's not weakness. That's adaptation. That's resilience. Let's talk about meaning, because this is where the experience of feeling out of place intersects with something much larger: how you construct a sense of purpose and significance in your life. There are fundamentally two different orientations toward meaning, and the difference between them explains a huge amount about why some people feel perpetually out of place, while others feel at home almost anywhere. The first orientation is narrative meaning. This is when you derive significance from being part of a story larger than yourself. You're a character in a collective narrative: your family's story, your community's story, your nation's story, your religion's story. Your role gives you meaning. Your position in the social structure gives you identity. And when you participate in the rituals and traditions of that narrative, when you fulfill your role, you feel a deep sense of purpose. This is how most humans have constructed meaning throughout history. It's tribal, it's relational, it's inherently social. The second orientation is creative meaning. This is when you derive significance from generating something new, from understanding something deeply, from expressing something internal. You're not a character in someone else's story. You're the author of your own. Your meaning doesn't come from fitting into a pre-existing structure. It comes from building, from creating, from discovering. And critically, this type of meaning is much less dependent on external validation. It's intrinsic, it's self-generated. Guess which orientation people who feel chronically out of place tend to have? If you identified with everything I've described so far, you're almost certainly oriented toward creative meaning. And here's the problem. The world is overwhelmingly structured around narrative meaning. Jobs, families, communities, even most friendships, they're all built on the assumption that meaning comes from participation in shared stories. Be a good employee. Be a good parent. Be a loyal friend. Be a contributing member of society. All of these are roles in narratives that already exist. But if your brain doesn't derive meaning from roles, if fulfilling a predefined position in a social structure feels empty to you, then you're going to feel out of place in every context that's built around narrative meaning. It's not that you can't do those things. You can be an employee, a partner, a friend. But it won't feel meaningful in the way it feels meaningful to other people. It'll feel like you're going through motions, playing a part, waiting for something more substantial that never quite arrives. Research on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation maps onto this almost perfectly. People oriented toward creative meaning are intrinsically motivated. They need the work itself to be engaging, the idea itself to be compelling, the relationship itself to be authentic. External rewards, status, approval, belonging, those things matter less. People oriented toward narrative meaning are more extrinsically motivated. They need to know their efforts are recognized, that they're valued by the group, that they're fulfilling their role well. The work itself is less important than what the work represents socially. Neither is better. But if you're intrinsically motivated in an extrinsically motivated world, you're going to feel like everyone around you is chasing things that don't matter, while the things that matter to you are invisible to everyone else. You're going to feel out of place because the entire value system is different. It's like you're playing a completely different game while everyone else is keeping score in a game you don't even understand the rules to. And this is why so many people who feel out of place also feel a persistent sense of searching. You're searching for meaning that isn't role-based. You're searching for connection that isn't transactional. You're searching for purpose that doesn't require you to fit into someone else's narrative. And that search, that restless seeking, it's not a sign that you're lost. It's a sign that you're oriented toward a different type of significance than most people are. You're not broken. You're just playing a different game. Let's talk about flow, presence, and where your consciousness actually lives. Flow is that state where you're so absorbed in what you're doing that time disappears, self-consciousness vanishes, and you're completely present. Most people assume flow is rare, something that happens during peak experiences or highly engaging activities. But research by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who essentially defined the concept, shows that some people experience flow regularly, while others rarely do. And the difference isn't about the activities themselves. It's about where your attention naturally rests. For participators, flow often comes from social immersion. They enter flow states during conversations, during collaborative work, during group activities. Their consciousness lives in the space between people. They're externally oriented, and their attention flows outward naturally. When they're engaged with others, they're fully present because that external engagement is where their mind wants to be. For observers, flow rarely comes from social situations, no matter how engaging. Instead, it comes from solitary activities that demand deep focus: reading, writing, creating, analyzing, building, solving complex problems. Their consciousness lives in the internal space, in the realm of ideas and understanding. When they're alone with something intellectually or creatively demanding, that's when they're fully present. That's when time disappears. This difference is neurological. Brain imaging studies show that people have varying levels of what's called default mode network activity. The default mode network is the brain's resting state, the network that's active when you're not focused on external tasks. For some people, this network is relatively quiet. Their attention naturally orients outward. They're present with whatever's in front of them. For others, this network is highly active, even during external tasks. Their attention is constantly being pulled inward, into thought, into reflection, into internal processing. If you have a highly active default mode network, which many observers do, you're never fully external. Even when you're in a conversation, part of your mind is processing internally, reflecting, analyzing, making connections. You're there, but you're also in your head. And this is why social situations often feel exhausting. You're running two processes simultaneously, engaging externally and processing internally. Most people only run one. But here's what's important. This isn't a deficit. A highly active default mode network is associated with creativity, with abstract thinking, with the ability to make novel connections between disparate ideas. Your mind's tendency to stay partially internal isn't stopping you from being present. It's allowing you to process reality in a way that's richer and more complex than simple external engagement. You're not missing the moment. You're experiencing the moment plus the meta layer of reflection about the moment. You're living in two dimensions of consciousness simultaneously. The problem is that society values external presence almost exclusively. Be in the moment. Stop overthinking. Just be present. These instructions assume that internal processing is the enemy of presence, when actually it's just a different form of presence. You are present, just not in the way most people recognize as presence. You're present to your own internal experience, to the patterns you're noticing, to the thoughts arising in response to what's happening. That's not absence. That's depth. And this is why you feel out of place, because while everyone around you is living in the external moment, you're living in the internal moment, and those two realities don't overlap as much as people assume they do. You're in the same room, but you're not in the same experience. And neither of you is wrong. You're just experiencing reality through different attentional lenses. We're at the end now, and I want to tie all of this together into something clear and actionable, not in the sense of fixing yourself because there's nothing to fix, but in the sense of understanding yourself so completely that the feeling of being out of place loses its power. You are not broken. You are not missing some essential piece of social hardware that everyone else has. What you have is a different neurological and psychological architecture. You process social information through observation rather than simulation. Your reward system is calibrated toward depth rather than breadth. Your identity is internalized rather than relational. Your meaning comes from creation rather than participation. Your consciousness lives partially internal rather than fully external. All of these are valid, functional, intelligent ways of being human. They're just not the majority way. And because they're not the majority way, every social environment you walk into is going to feel slightly off. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because those environments are optimized for a different neurological profile. It's like being left-handed in a right-handed world. You can function, you can adapt, but nothing is quite designed for you. And after a lifetime of that, the cumulative effect is a persistent feeling of not quite belonging anywhere. But here's what changes when you understand this. You stop trying to fix yourself. You stop interpreting that feeling of being out of place as evidence of personal failure. You stop forcing yourself to enjoy things that your brain isn't wired to find rewarding. You stop pretending to be a participator when you're an observer, and instead, you start building a life that actually fits your architecture. That might mean seeking out smaller, deeper connections instead of trying to maintain large social networks. It might mean prioritizing solitary, creative work over collaborative roles. It might mean accepting that you'll never feel the kind of easy social belonging that other people feel, and that that's okay because you have access to types of meaning and depth that most people never touch. It might mean redefining what connection means for you, understanding that your version of intimacy looks different, feels different, but is no less real. You are not losing anything by being this way. You're not missing out on the full human experience. You're having a different human experience, one that's rarer, one that's harder to find community around, one that the world doesn't validate as readily, but one that is every bit as rich and meaningful as the majority experience. You're not on the outside looking in. You're in a different room entirely, one that most people never even know exists. The people who feel most at home in the world are not the happiest people. They're just the people whose neurology happens to align with the majority social structure. That alignment makes life easier, but it doesn't make life deeper. You have depth. You have insight. You have the ability to see patterns that others miss, to question assumptions that others accept, to create meaning that others consume. That's not a consolation prize. That's a different kind of power. So the next time you walk into a room and feel that familiar sense of disconnection, remember, you're not failing at being human. You're succeeding at being a specific type of human that exists outside the mainstream psychological profile. You're not out of place. You're just in a place that wasn't built for you. And the more you understand that, the more you can stop trying to fit and start building the kind of life where your particular way of being actually makes sense. You don't need to belong everywhere. You just need to belong to yourself. And once you do that, once you fully accept and understand your own psychological architecture, the feeling of being out of place doesn't disappear, but it stops hurting. It becomes information instead of judgment. It becomes a compass instead of a curse. You're not broken. You're not lost. You're exactly what you're supposed to be. And that, in itself, is enough. If this resonated with you, if you found yourself nodding along to parts of this, there's more where this came from. The next video explores what happens when observers try to force themselves into participator roles, the psychological cost of sustained inauthenticity, and how to recognize when you're betraying your own architecture for the sake of fitting in. It's worth watching if you've ever felt like you're exhausting yourself trying to be someone you're not.